Is the probability of terrorist attacks on the United States directly related to whether or not the U.S. has troops in Iraq? The consequences of the U.S. withdrawing its troops from Iraq, particularly in the short term, has been a big part of the administration's rationale for keeping troops there and for opposing some type of timetable. In a recent poll, we asked Americans to tell us their views on this consequences issue. First of all, are terrorist attacks on the U.S. more likely to happen if the U.S. withdraws its troops, or more likely to happen if the U.S. keeps its troops there, or will it really make no difference? Majority of Americans say that it makes no difference. In other words, the probability or the possibility of terrorist attacks on the U.S. is going to be the same regardless of whether or not the U.S. leaves its troops in Iraq. And that's an important point because Vice President Dick Cheney and others have really stressed that if the U.S. leaves too early from Iraq, it would embolden the terrorists to attack the U.S. The public apparently does not agree. We got at this issue in a different way by asking Americans if it is probable that there would be attacks in the U.S. if the U.S. withdraws its troops. And then in a totally separate question, we said, is it probable that there will be attacks in the U.S. by terrorists if the U.S. keeps its troops in Iraq? 51% of Americans say that there will be terrorist attacks on U.S. soil if the U.S. keeps its troops in Iraq. 55% say there will be attacks by terrorists in the U.S. if the United States removes its troops from Iraq. In other words, same kind of finding. The public apparently doesn't think that whether or not we, that is the U.S., has troops in Iraq is going to make a big difference in terms of the probability or possibility of U.S. suffering from terrorist attacks. Finally, an interesting question we ask Americans: if the U.S. withdraws its troops and the conditions in Iraq are at least as bad as they are now, would you consider that the U.S. had lost the war in Iraq? And a slight plurality of 49% say no, they do not think the U.S. would have lost. Bottom line out of all of this, Americans don't believe that the possibility of terrorist attacks in the U.S. are really directly related to whether or not we, the U.S., has troops in Iraq. And Americans, at least a slight plurality, say the U.S. will not have lost the war even if it withdraws its troops and things aren't any better than they are today. Coming up on the Daily Briefing, we'll look at Americans' views on retirement. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Editor-in-Chief of the Gallup poll with Democracy on Demand. Take the Daily Briefing with you. Search for Gallup at the iTunes Music Store.